Hi everyone, and welcome to today's virtual breakfast on winning the SERPs, the search engine results page, a story of SERP feature trends by industry, keyword, and device. Today we're going to be looking at a few things, including how complex a SERP is. We're going to be comparing United States versus United Kingdom SERP feature trends data. And crucially, as a result of that, we're going to identify what SERP features you as a company and brand should be optimizing for. But crucially as well, we're breaking it down by industry itself so that regardless of which type of company you work in, you'll be able to hopefully take away a key insight specific to your industry that you work in, operate in. And finally, we're going to wrap it up in terms of best practices so that you can win the SERP. SERP features simply exist to help us find information, but it's complex. 15% of Google searches have never been seen before, and that's from just one search engine. There are over 20 free access search engines that are regularly used worldwide, for example, Bing and DuckDuckGo. And when we start thinking about what type of behaviors happen on those search engines, it can be massively different than what it is on Google. So understanding the SERPs and understanding your keyword performance on multiple search engines is absolutely critical for all digital marketers. And when we simply find information, there's two ways in which we do it. We've got the push method. So for example, you're using maybe on a mobile phone, Google Discover. So that's when you're on, for instance, Google Chrome as an app on your phone, and you'll actually see in there, there's little feeds of articles that actually sends them to you. They're pushing the information to you. Other ways in which you may directly do it is through, for example, an RSS feed. And what that simply means is you're interested in certain websites. You want to be notified when they produce new content. So you can do that. It's actually a nice way to look at what your competitors are doing as well. And the second way in which we find information is through pull. So literally we can be a conversation tonight in a restaurant with our friends, and we're literally asking them questions. We're pulling for information. And equally so, when we think of pull, we're doing that when we actually Google an actual keyword and get results. And when we pull to find information, we have different modes of searching. We've got lookup, learn, and investigate. And this is exactly why SERP features themselves exist. When we look up information, we're usually using carefully specified queries, and it's often around things like fact retrieval. But that's actually as a result why we have things like featured snippets, instant answers, and so on. When we learn, it requires some type of processing, usually related to cognition. And it's actually about knowledge acquisition. So for instance, using a map or what we call local pack to try and find the directions from A to B. And finally, the third one is investigate, which is usually where search is at its best. It's often described because it's a conversation where the searcher is in a session. He or she is carrying out loads of different searches, and they're just using multiple queries to do that over longer periods of time. And often they're doing this for analysis, evaluation, and even discovery. And that's why things like, for example, related questions and related searches also exist. Now, when we think about how is the search process actually summarized, what we can see is there's three core pillars of it. The first is keywords. So voice search, for example, is actually going to completely remove a SERP feature as and when it becomes really dominant. And that SERP feature is did you mean, which is actually around misspells of keywords. Voice search is going to overcome and actually completely remove misspells. It may get things out of context, but it's never going to misspell keywords that we say via voice. The second stage is around processing, and this is where the engine essentially gets those keywords the searchers search for, and it then processes those keywords to try and understand what are the best results that I can actually display here. And this is where things like LSA, if you're into SEO, and BERT exists. And essentially what they're trying to work out is not necessarily what the searcher's searching for now, what are they likely to search for next to better understand the query that they're doing now. That's essentially what it means. And what they do is when they have that understanding, they go to the top tier, the third pillar in this case, which is actually giving us results. And that's going to be today's focus on the types of results that the engine gives. But it's hugely complex. There are roughly speaking 6 common type of behaviors that we have when we actually do a search. So we have, for example, pogo sticking, which you'll see in the middle, which is what we describe as search at its best because it's a conversation. It's that investigation type query where someone's gone in, has completed a search, they get really good quality results, and they actually interact with several documents. This is why, for example, you'll often see that visits are often much higher than search volume, because if a keyword is getting, for instance, 1,000 searches on a monthly basis, it could be that one of those searches is literally investigating several documents, and therefore visits can often be much higher than actually search volume. And on the flip side, every single search has to end. Just because we're doing a search on a mobile phone whilst we're in a queue to get a coffee in the morning, doesn't mean that that's a bad search if that search closes the browser. Every search has to end. And equally so, understanding these behaviors and understanding things like bounce rates and all of these types of user behaviors is really, really important for us, because we want to really properly measure the digital world and have a good idea of what's actually happening on not just my website, but of that of my key competitors. And zero clicks further complicates SERP interactions. So when, for example, someone does a search for Biden age, 95% of people click on nothing. What that basically means is people are actually getting their information directly from the SERP. They're processing that information. They don't need to click on anything. So zero clicks is a really super useful metric to use from Similarweb, because what it's doing is actually starting to account for some of these types of complex behaviors in the back end automatically in a really simple metric out of 100%. So when we're looking at keywords, we don't want to just be looking at search volume, because in theory, Biden age would be a good keyword. You can see in the bottom right-hand side, it's growing in demand. But actually, when you start to account for things like zero clicks, it's actually a very weak keyword. It's not likely to get us more traffic to our website. So what we need to do keyword research well is start to look at SERP features and really start to think about what types of keywords do I want to rank well for, and looking at a range of metrics to justify that keyword itself is a really good term. So SERP features simply exist to help us with those three modes of search engine, but actually it differs enormously by keyword and even by topics. So you can see here on the left-hand side, running shoes. And for anyone that's not familiar with SERPs, it stands for Search Engine Results Page. And essentially what we have is we have these little features or elements within the SERP itself. So on the left-hand side, you can see we have what we call product listing ads, or PLAs. And below that, you've got towards the middle of the left-hand side pillar, you've got maps, which we call local pack. And essentially that's what we're going to be looking at in today's webinar. We're going to be showing you all of these different little elements by industry so that you can start to understand what key things are actually happening for each of your industries. So let's dive in so you can win the SERPs. Before we do that, I want to just quickly recap on some of our methodologies we've used. What we wanted to do is to set out to find, are the US and UK different in terms of SERP features? We also wanted to identify what are the top 10 most prominent SERP features in both of those markets, but also to look at that by branded and non-branded keywords, as well as by the two core devices of mobile and desktop. And crucially, as mentioned before, we want to look at this by industry. So we had to do this, we analyzed 4 billion keywords across both the UK and the US markets. We did this across 27 different SERP features themselves across 12 different industries. So going forward, when I say branded keyword, it basically means it's a direct association with one company. So for example, Sony or Walt Disney, because they're owned by an entity, that would be called what we would call a branded keyword. When we say non-branded, we basically mean that keyword can belong to many brands. So for example, office chair or standing desk isn't really owned by one brand, therefore it'd be called a non-branded keyword. Some of the industries we analysed were things like, for example, e-commerce and shopping, mental health, news and media, as well as travel and tourism. And when we say SERP features, we mean some of these things on the far right-hand side of this slide. So for example, apps in the case of mobile, instant answers on the case of both devices. In this section, when we say SERP features, we're actually excluding 4 SERP features. They are for images, related questions, related searches, and organic site links. And here's why. Out of those 4 billion keywords we analysed, the majority of those keywords have at least one, if not all 4 of those SERP features. So the top tip that brands need to be doing is actually starting to exclude some noise when we talk of SERP features. Just because you have things like related searches and related questions, for example, it's not really good for our strategies because it's not really going to benefit us overall in our brand. We're much better focused on things like maps if you've got physical stores, or instant answers if you've got really good quality content. And the reason for this is in the United States, for branded keywords, 27% of those 4 billion keywords had one or all four or multiple of those 4 SERP features of images, related questions, related searches, and organic inlinks. That's even more prominent in non-branded keywords. In fact, even more so in the UK. You can see on the right-hand side of this slide, 47% of keywords in the United Kingdom, virtually half of them, have at least a combination of these 4 basic SERP features. So we want to remove the noise and exclude those from our analysis. The good news is on both markets, SERP features are increasing massively. So on the left-hand side, you can see this SERP feature trends for the United States. On the right-hand side, you'll see it for the UK. You can see that the rate of growth is much higher in the United States versus the UK. And interestingly, at the start of this year, 2022, you can see there's actually a slight decline in SERP features. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on, particularly for your own website. Now, when we break this down to branded performance, we can see on the blue line, the United States, the red line, the UK, we can see that actually branded keywords is actually going flatline virtually in the United Kingdom. That's not really the case in the United States. So branded keywords provide a massive opportunity for both markets. Non-branded keywords are the ones that are growing significantly and more so in the United States versus the UK. And when we look at device, we can also see that the United States is by far the most prominent market when it comes to SERP features. In fact, it's the same on both devices of desktop on the left, mobile on the right, but the rate of growth on mobile is increasing enormously, because you can see here that actually from the middle of last year, you can see that the number of SERP features has increased almost to its peak. Now, when we actually look at SERP feature trends and get roll-ups over longer periods of time, we actually see a lot of overlap between the various markets. So related searches, related questions, images, paid, and video are the top 5 most prominent SERP features in both markets. But one of the really good ways, because SERP features are highly volatile, one of the good ways to analyze this data is to look at it in shorter, more frequent periods of time. Because as you can see on the left-hand side, the top most prominent SERP feature in the United States is related searches. But actually, when you look at the United Kingdom on the right-hand side, it's hotels, which makes sense. The UK now has no laws or restrictions around travel. And actually, as a result, Google in this case has jumped in on that, and they're actually displaying a lot more hotels for the United Kingdom. And when we start looking at the volatility of SERP features, we can see they're massively volatile. Just because we say something's dominant doesn't mean it's always dominant. Yes, there's sometimes quite clear lines of a dominant SERP feature themselves, but actually there are ones that are really, really close. So when we're saying first, second, and third, always note in the back of your mind, let me investigate that further and what types of keywords come up for these particular SERP features. And super interesting, I think SERP features themselves are going to become a lot more real-time due to COVID. So when you start looking at when the first lockdown occurred in the United Kingdom, as you can see on this chart, you can see that SERP features in this case for Google Maps were a bit slow to reduce the number of Google Maps on the SERP, but it actually only took Google a few weeks to do it on the 2nd and 3rd official lockdown. They actually knew that people physically couldn't go places, so they actually reduced the number of Google Maps to be shown and actually displaying other types of SERP features instead. In this case, it was actually instant answers. So people were actually trying to find information as opposed to going to a restaurant because they were closed. And SERP features is actually not just about volatility, but it's actually about trying to now become more real time and trying to find out what types of things are actually occurring in the particular market. So that's also why we should be looking at SERP features on a much more frequent, regular basis. Now, when we look at the annual differences in terms of the SERP features themselves, so looking at 2020 versus 2021, we can see that all SERP features, excluding video, are increasing significantly in both markets. Interestingly, in the United Kingdom, video is on a slight decline phase annually. But then again, when we start thinking about Google, they own YouTube, which is essentially a search engine itself. So it may be, if you're focusing a lot on video, it may actually suggest, and again, we need to let the data direct this, but by the end of the year, if we're seeing a similar pattern, if I was working for a brand, I would want to have more than ever a YouTube specific strategy, because it may be relying on trying to get traffic from Google for videos is actually a weaker way to do this in the United Kingdom. And it seems to suggest, the data, that this is also going to occur in the United States. So it's one also to keep an eye on. So let's jump into SERP features by industry and identify the top 3 most prominent SERP features for each of these industries. The first is e-commerce. Product listing ads, images, and videos are the top 3 most prominent SERP features in both markets. But interestingly, as you can see in these 2 highlighted columns, instant answers and local pack are much bigger in the United States versus the UK. In fact, they'd be the 2nd and 3rd respective SERP features in the United States market. So what this also suggests behind the scenes is a brand should never, global brands in multiple markets, should never have a SERP feature strategy globally. Always look at the local market data first to direct what we should be doing as digital marketeers and SEOs. In the food, drink, groceries, we can see again, product listing ads is quite prominent, followed then by local pack and images. But interestingly, instant answers provides a much larger opportunity here in the United States versus the UK. In sports, Twitter, news, and featured tables, instant answers are the top most prominent SERP features themselves. Interestingly, Google has a partnership with Twitter. And basically what it does as a result of having that partnership is when you post a link, a URL in a tweet, Google actually automatically indexes that tweet. But Google also knows that Twitter is a real-time engine. Essentially, it's providing real up-to-date information. And in this case, in the case of sports, it's actually looking at authoritative people who are on Twitter displaying things like what's the latest score, because that's something Google can't do in index almost in real time. So in this case, it actually embeds Twitter into the results so that people can get the freshest, latest, up-to-date information, literally to the very second of what's going on, in this case in sports. In food and drink, restaurants, you can see that local pack, knowledge graph, and related searches are the top 3 most prominent engines. But also note, look how bigger in the United States in the second pillar here. You can see that knowledge graph is so much bigger in the United States versus the UK. Mental health, again, a lot of content required here in terms of EAT, which is exerting expertise, authority, and trustworthiness. That's what we mean by EAT content. And you can start to see this when we start to look at industries, in this case, mental health, because when you see a lot of featured lists, featured answers, related questions, related searches, instant answers, when they're the top most prominent SERP features, we need to make sure our content isn't just the same or a little bit better than what else is out there. It needs to be the market leader. It needs to be completely different. It needs to exert expertise, authority, and trust. In jobs and careers, no surprise, jobs is the most prominent SERP feature for this particular industry. Law and government, again, a lot of expertise here required, because you can see things like instant featured answers, knowledge graph, featured tables. That also indirectly is saying that EAT content is very, very important. Beauty and cosmetics, you've got things like featured lists, featured answers, product listing ads. But interestingly here in the United States, instant answers provides a much larger opportunity than it does in the UK. In fashion, product listing ads are huge, followed by images, an older school SERP feature that actually has existed for about 15, 16 years. Images are very prominent in the fashion space. News and media is the most diverse, rich industry. And this is the one to watch, even if you don't work in this industry, because this may well be a prediction as to what all of those other industries are going to follow. You can see from this slide that actually SERP features are massively diverse and quite prominent in both markets. And in fact, what this also suggests behind the scene is the algorithm is very, very similar in terms of what things it displays. So in this case, Google for news and media types of keywords has really locked down for both the United States and the UK what types of information to serve There are slight differences. For example, in the UK, instant answers is a little bit higher than it is in the US. And the same goes for things like knowledge graph. But overall, there's a lot of consistencies and similarities in this particular industry. Travel, flights and hotels, a bit like careers, no surprise that there's two prominent SERP features. Other ones to look at are local pack, knowledge graph and paid. So now we've got all this information, let's go through a few top tips so that you guys can start winning the SERPs. The first thing is don't ignore your branded keywords and don't be ignoring branded SERP features. In fact, interestingly, you can actually create your own SERP features for your own branded keywords. Don't be just looking at your pure brand keyword. For example, Netflix. You want to be looking at things like Netflix subscription, Netflix customer support email. Those keywords are really, really useful to be analyzing, because actually if you start structuring your content and use things like schema, you can actually appear for things like an instant answer. In the case of Netflix, what is their email for customer support? Super interesting, because both markets actually have a very close correlation in terms of the number of branded keywords that they actually show for both of those markets. Like good SEO, search engines classify keywords. We need to start classifying our keywords. And if you're strapped for time, do it for your most important line of business. The old school way of doing this is looking at keywords and saying, are they informational, navigational, or transactional? I.e., do I want to find, get, or buy? And actually an older school way of actually looking at keywords is to say, are they commercial? Are they non-commercial? Are they a little bit in between? The best way to segment your keywords is by what we call the buyer's journey. And this actually indirectly starts to build your integrated search strategy across Google, Amazon, and YouTube. What we want to be doing is segmenting our keywords into awareness, consideration, decision, and inspiration. So here's how to do it. Simply using those 4 categories, start to look at your keywords and think about what is the best category to put that keyword in. So let's imagine, for example, you work for a stationery company. The word paper would what we would call an awareness keyword, because the searcher doesn't know what they want. Consideration, on the other hand, would be something like printer paper. That searcher isn't looking for paper, which could be wallpaper, it could be for a printer, it could be any type of paper at all. Whereas when someone does a search for A4 printer paper, they know what they want. It's a decision term. But actually, inspiration can provide a lot of opportunities, particularly around video, actually on YouTube, where you're actually going and doing outside the box thinking. For example, how to make an airplane out of printer paper. So what you're doing is manually going through your keywords, putting them into these categories. There may be some instances in some industries where one keyword can go into multiple categories, but essentially what you can start to unlock here is, what are the most prominent SERP features for my awareness keywords? What are the most prominent SERP features for my decision keywords? And that can really help you as a brand to better understand and tighten up your own strategy. Review the latest SERP features. So as mentioned before, hotels is the most prominent SERP feature when we look at December, January, and February 2022 data. That's not the case in the United States. It's the second most prominent SERP feature. So yes, it's okay to a certain extent to have a few SERP features that you're going to look at globally, but making sure that they're always localized, and that strategy is very different by each of those markets because things change. If you're focusing on video, keep a close eye on what videos you're ranking for, particularly on Google and particularly in the United Kingdom, because they seem to be on the decline phase. And SERP features actually help you to start building your integrated search strategy. So very quickly, and again, we can do a separate webinar on this. Essentially, what you want to be doing is looking at the results themselves and looking at SERP features to better understand what should I be doing. So when people, for example, do a search in the United Kingdom for LED lights, you'll see that Amazon appears here twice. And actually the other results are all e-commerce websites. This would actually suggest that when you see Amazon double bubbles, we would maybe want to consider having an Amazon specific strategy. In this case, if we sold LED lights, we would want to actually potentially look at Amazon and sell our LED lights on that as an engine. Secondly, when you're looking at things like air conditioning unit, which has got a typical Google SERP associated with it, you may just want to have a Google strategy. So looking at all of these SERP features we've talked at today. But when you see really prominent YouTube videos like timelines and so on, which you can see on the right-hand side, you maybe want to start thinking about building your YouTube specific strategy. And the good news is we have a thing called Keyword Generator, which allows you to do that using on-site search data for all 3 of these search engines. So when you're looking at SERP features using Similarweb, there's two core ways of doing it. You can look at it at a keyword level, which allows you to basically analyze keywords or a group of keywords in a list. Or secondly, you can actually look at it at domain level, in which case you can find out what SERP features are my competitors ranking for and getting traffic from versus which ones am I missing out on. And that can really help us to develop our strategy. Know your SERP features by industry. Every industry is massively different. And as noted, news and media is the most diverse in terms of the number of SERP features and in terms of consistency between the United States and the UK markets. And if you guys want to find out more about this, simply click on this URL, which allows you to download a report, which you can get access to all of this data we've looked at today. And if you want, and you're not a client of ours, you can simply book a demo to actually find out for your particular website, for keywords that matter to you, what types of SERP features do they have. One of our team will show you what they are. So to summarize it up so far and what we talked about today, there are many different types of SERP behaviors, and SERP features simply exist to help us find quality information as quickly as we can. And there are significant opportunities in both the United States and the United Kingdom markets. But actually, SERP features are becoming a lot more real-time, particularly due to COVID. So looking at them on a more frequent basis is critical. And finally, make sure we're categorizing our keywords so that we can monitor not just best practice in terms of the buyer's journey, but actually monitor SERP features that are aligned to the buyer's journey so you can better understand what your strategy should be. Thank you very much for everyone's time. Ed, do we want to take a few questions? Do we have any questions come in?
Yes, I think we have Danielle Franco and Scarlett who raise their hand. I can allow them to talk, or they can
Perfect.
put a question. So Scarlett says, if you look in the chat, there's a question.
You can always do a holistic search of your target keywords and use Google to see what features show up. So that was more of a comment. Yes, so basically it's, let me just scroll up, sorry, 2 seconds. Sorry, Ed, where's the question from Scarlett? So there's a question here, will you be able to share the slides? Yes, we will do. People also ask. No, people also ask is its own, people also ask is what we call related searches. So it's essentially the same thing where people are also in a session. That's why I actually mentioned the different types of behaviors, because actually what Google in this case is trying to do is to suggest other queries to try and keep them engaged in a session. So that's what we call related searches and related questions in our SERP features instead of people also ask. So that's that question. Were those pie charts UK on the left, US on the right? No, it was, for the most part, it was United States on the left-hand side, United Kingdom on the right-hand side. But again, we'll share the presentation after so you can get the data for yourself. For the industries not mentioned here, for example, construction, how do you go about finding the most popular SERP features? So what you need to do is actually create a keyword list, is what we would call. So for construction, for example, you would look at like building, new house renovation, those types of keywords. And what you're then going to do is build that keyword list, or actually ideally multiple, and ideally actually by buyer's journey. So for example, builders would be what we would call an awareness keyword, whereas things like house renovation in London might be consideration, where that searcher is actually more likely to go and convert with you and interact with you as a brand. So once you build those types of keyword lists out that are all categorized in that order, what you can then do is use a feature that we call analyze keywords. And essentially that allows you to find out what SERP features are most prominent for an individual keyword or a whole collection of keywords. People also ask in instant answers, we've already clarified that. Would you recommend to try to always have video content on your posts as good? Yes, that's actually a really good question. So I would never recommend more than one video to one page on a website, because actually you're at risk of not being indexed for the other videos if you embed multiple on one page. So making sure that that video is directly relevant to that content. And the reason for this is actually EAT. So in SEO, we often talk about EAT quite a bit, which is those expertise, authority, and trust. And essentially what you want to do is you want to structure and write content, textual content, and embed a really relevant video, which actually is directly relevant to that content. And that's actually more likely to help you succeed, but also make sure you're using a thing called schema, which your web developer can help you with, or someone in the technical SEO department. And what that allows you to do is to structure that content to make sure that search engines know what that video is about, and where it also lives elsewhere on the web. Are you able to do a session on how to win a search from a technical perspective? For example, how to format content to appear in answer boxes. Really good point. We'll definitely consider that and do a future webinar. So basically a guide or best practices on what to do to rank for a particular SERP feature. Absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone's time, and we'll be in touch soon over email. Have a good rest of your day.